G'day everyone and welcome back to the channel. So today what I'm going to talk about is I'd like to broach the topic of gluteal weakness, and more specifically I want to discuss why gluteal weakness is more than just weak glute muscles. So the muscles in your hip, we see with a lot of people who have knee dysfunction, lower back problems, athletes in general, just anyone walking around, it can be really common to be labelled with gluteal weakness. And we do this because when we test out your hip strength, whether that be a side lying position, squats, lunges, whatever it is, we can directly observe that either that one side may be weaker than the other, or that both sides aren't as weak or aren't as strong, as they could be. There's always potential for growth in a lot of people. And traditionally what we've looked at in this space is we tend to look at gluteal weakness as just a muscle that becomes weaker, and we can sort of attribute that, or we tend to attribute that to things like not being used correctly and all these sorts of ideas. We develop these excuses for why a muscle becomes weak, but interestingly it's not necessarily the case. Now, true muscle weakness does occur, and what we see traditionally, generally in clinic, and you probably experienced this yourself, is when you have an acute injury. So say you sprain your ankle, or you get some trauma to your knee, or you have surgery and you have tissue that's damaged, and a natural response to that damaged tissue can be that the musculature around that sort of atrophies a little bit. It gets weaker because it's not being used correctly or enough, and it sort of morphs based on the situation that it's in. If there's swelling and pain, that can switch off muscles and stop them from working, and so you can sort of lose some of the strength and the conditioning in the area. As I said, same thing after surgery. If you have an operation somewhere, you have to cut through something, it's not abnormal to expect the musculature around that area to become physically weaker when you test it. It makes sense. But for some reason, that sort of subgroup of muscular weakness is something that we tend to just apply to everything. So if you're someone who's just never had an injury, and you go to the gym, or you do some exercises, or you get assessed somehow, and someone says, well, your right glute is weaker than your left glute, we never really expand on that and give you reasons for why that happens. And so what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about my experience in sort of trying to figure out why muscles become weak when they're not in the presence of damage. And that sort of tends to account for a lot of people. And it's a little bit different to what we would expect. So what I'd like everyone to do is, if you have someone close by, test out your glute strength. So a good way to do that is to lie on your side, have your hand on the bony bump sort of at the side of your hip bone, just come up a little bit and back a little bit. This is where some of the glute muscles reside, and I'll get you to roll slightly past sort of vertical so that the top of your hip's almost pointing slightly to the ground. So not straight ahead, but slightly to the ground. And then having your foot, your heel, you can't see it on me here, but your heel, where are we? Heel pointing up. I'm going to get you to keep your back straight and just lift your heel up. So the reason why we're leaning forwards is we're actually sort of going back a little bit, but I want to use gravity. So if you're leaning forwards, we're just going to get you to do this. Now, if you don't have someone to play with here, we'll just get you to do 10 or 15 of these. Get a sense of how this feels, how easy it feels, how many you can do if you can't get to 15, how shaky you feel. If you have someone close by, get them to hold your foot and then push up into their hand and gauge how strong that feels. Get them to remember that. Change sides, do the same thing. And then what we can do with a different set of glute muscles, more towards the back pocket here, is we can have your knees together to begin with, leaning forward again slightly, and then lifting up that knee. Again, if you have someone resist that to get a sensation of how strong you are. But again, same thing. Just do it 10 or 15. Don't roll back. Keep everything still. Just lift up that hip as high as you feel comfortable. Get a sense of how those muscles feel. Because what we want to do is, when I sort of discuss why that's become a little bit weaker, or how to give yourself more strength instantaneously, we want to make sure that you have something to compare it to. So we're going to talk about this in a second. Then I'll get you to do the exercise that I'll show you, then recheck your strength again, or get someone to recheck your strength again. You should feel an immediate bump in strength. So, and it's a really important feature, because one of the things that we see a lot is that glute muscle weakness isn't a weakening of the muscle, it tends to be a deactivation. So if you think about muscles themselves, every muscle in your body is controlled by your nervous system that originates from your spine. So for the purposes of this explanation, for your hips, your glutes, there's a section in your lower back, sort of at the base of your rib cage and just a little bit lower, that has a lot of nerves that supply your glute muscles. And again, what we often don't realize is if your back is stiff, if your back is overloaded, if your back is tight, the function of those nerves at that level where the stiffness and the tightness is diminished. So it's very similar to putting a kink in a hose, where that kink in the hose happens sort of in the spine potentially, and the ramifications of that, the drop off in pressure, or in this case, the drop off in force, can be seen at the areas that they supply. So we sort of know this intuitively when we talk about sciatica, for example, where if you have a disc bulge or some issues in your lower back right down the base, it can compromise the sciatic nerve, and you can get all these symptoms, referred pains, weakness, pins and needles, tingling, whatever it is, into the foot and into the calf. And we sort of are at a point now where we understand that that's a thing. But there's a whole range of other less obvious symptoms that can happen that aren't as sinister to the rest of the body. So there's generally a section in that sort of mid to sort of lower back that gets stiff and tight. It's like a kink in a hose, and it basically shuts down the electrical signals, for want of a better phrase, or want of a better description, that supply the muscles. So instead of that water pressure being at full pressure all the time like it should be, that kink in the hose just reduces the amount of force available at those muscles. And we see this clinically because this often explains why someone can have a glute that's weaker on one side but not the other. Despite being symmetrical people, you can have brilliant athletes that are very powerful, very athletic, but they still have a weakness, an observable weakness there, which doesn't make sense because they're moving a lot, they're using their body a lot. You don't have a lazy muscle, it's not bad luck. It's very likely a specific consequence to something spinal that's going on that you just haven't been aware of. So if you can do some gluteal testing to begin with, do this exercise that I'll show you, and then we'll do some gluteal testing again at the end. Do not take my word for this. What you should find is once you find and free up a specific section of your back, you deserve to feel like those glutes get stronger straight away. Your ability to produce more force, to feel less shaky, maybe even a little bit more range of motion, depending on what the consequences have been for you, is very real. And it's something that we don't look at because the spine often isn't painful in a lot of people. It can just be stiff, but it's creating a negative consequence for the area that it supplies, which in this case is often the glutes. So the exercise itself, like most of these things, is relatively simple. So I prefer a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball. You can use a foam roller. We're going to use an object to press into your back to de-stiffen some joints, and then we're going to make sure that you feel a difference afterwards. So how that looks is, again, this section that we've spoken about a lot, this base of the rib cage and a little bit lower, is a really important spot for the function of your hips and legs. So we want to start with the ball or the roller sort of at the base of your rib cage. Because this is a ball, we just want to roll it off to one side. So for me, I'll go to my left-hand side. Doesn't matter which side you start on, but the point is that you're not going all the way out to the side. You want to start where the bumps are and then just literally roll off of that onto the fleshy part. And then we just lie down. So again, we've done this before, and I'll link to a video up in the corner here so you can see that one if you need more detail. But the idea here is we want to find a spot that feels stiff and tight. It doesn't have to be tender, and we just want to stay here. We want to let the ball sink in, let it sort of separate that stiff tissue, let your nervous system become accustomed to this, and we want to see change, we want to feel change. Now, just to be very specific with this, and we've mentioned this before previously, is it doesn't matter which glute is weaker for you. If you have a glute on the right-hand side that's become weaker, it doesn't necessarily mean that the joints in the back on the right are going to be stiff. We're looking more at the segments itself, so it can be left or right. So what we want to do here is, if you're on the left-hand side and you think, gee, I understand maybe how tight that feels, I've got a sense of that, compare it to the exact same spot on the other side and get a sense of how that compares. So if the right-hand side doesn't feel as tight and stiff and it feels like it sinks in easier, then for you, you need to spend the most time working on the other side, that left-hand side, because that's where the stiffness is. So the goal here is to hunt for your stiff and tight spots. Generally, it's going to be on the same side, so it doesn't switch from side to side as you go up. Generally, it's the same side, and then if it does switch, it'll stay on that same side as it goes higher. So it's very sort of easy to keep staying in the same sort of area. And again, what we want to do is, once you've freed that up, where you feel like it's become less symptomatic than it was before, then just move the ball up a little bit or move the ball down a little bit. Go hunting for the areas, make sure that you clear everything that you can find. And then as soon as you've done that, I'll get you to pop back down again into the same test that you did before. So leaning forwards, legs straight, foot turned down with your heel up, and then just doing a few of these. And again, it's probably very hard to see this in the video, but it feels easier for me. It feels like I have more control. It doesn't feel as shaky. It feels more effortless, if that's a correct phrase. And then when I come to my external rotators at the back here, again, it feels a little bit tight for me at the moment, but it still feels easier to do. I feel like I could do more if I wanted to than before. But as I said, it's easy to sort of fake those results on camera. So it's really important that you do this yourself, because clinically for me personally, I haven't seen someone yet in close to 15 years where if you test their glute strength, you find their lower back stiffness and retest their glute strength, that doesn't get better. And obviously it can take some time to get back to full rat power if you've been stiff and tight in that back for a long time. But it's a really important point to make, because the path to strengthening your glutes, which support obviously great hip function, which support your lower back, which support your knee, it's no longer about who can work the hardest at strengthening your glutes. Obviously, you can punish yourself if you want to with the clams or the straight leg raises or the side leg raises, sorry. You can do a lot of squats with a band around your legs to hold your knees out. You can do all these sort of exercises, bridges, anything that you want to do, anything that you feel comfortable doing is completely fine. But the secret is if you sort of doing that while there's a handbrake on. So your capacity to make change, there's a ceiling on that, and you can still become quite good and change a lot of your symptoms, but there's never a guarantee that you're not going to get weaker again, because you haven't addressed the central component of why that's become weaker, or what feels weaker and presents weaker in the first place. And again, if you've been following along all these videos before, you'll hopefully appreciate that everything has to happen for a reason. The body is an amazing piece of machinery. It's designed to function well all the time. That's our default. And we often forget that the modern world and a lot of our habits and lifestyle choices have this sort of hidden effect on the health and function of the body. So the goal is always normal, and if something's abnormal, there has to be a reason for it. And as I said, if you have a glute that's weaker than the other, it's not that it's lazy or that you just don't use that side as much. Use and non-use shouldn't necessarily equal dysfunction. It should just equal tissue that's better or less better, essentially. Dysfunction becomes introduced when things are loaded poorly over a long period of time. We start to change the mechanical nature of how things should be working, and most dysfunction is just your body trying to cope with that change in function. So and often that change is hidden. It's not something that hurts, so we're not wired to care about it. But if you're willing to look for it and you know what to look for, then invariably you can start to solve those problems. And you don't have to guess, because when you do something, you can see a tangible effect, and hopefully the one that you're after. So if you keep taking a step back, so if we know that potentially your weak glute or a glute weakness is because the back's stiff, tight, and dysfunctional, there has to be a reason why that back is stiff, tight, and dysfunctional, because that's also abnormal. So, and again, from clinical experience, if there's a section of your back, sort of down here, for example, at the back, that you find is stiff, you know, more so than lower back, more so than higher up, and if it's your right side more than your other side, there has to be a very specific reason why this small section of the machine has become rusty and stiff. And generally, when we look back at how you do the things that you do, we find the answers. So, and again, you would have heard this before if you've seen these videos, but if you've got a specific section here that's stiff and tight and it's shutting down your hips, generally that comes back to a shape where you have to be bending through your spine until you bring in that level, and then there might be a bit of a rotational twist involved that sort of biases one side more than the other. So for a lot of people, generally it comes back to what you spend the most time doing throughout the day is at least a good starting point. You want to tick that off first. For most people, I'd always recommend looking at how you sit on the couch, how you sit on the computer, how you sit when you drive, if driving's a big thing, if you sit up in bed and watch TV or use your phone. Even if you don't sit and you stand and bend over all day, so if you spend a lot of time in the kitchen, you clean a lot, you work a job like a physical therapist who's leaning over a lot of the time, there has to be a reason why you're biasing a certain level of your spine and a certain side of your spine that you need to address if you want that stiffness to go away and those glutes to be robust and strong forever, because that's what they're supposed to be. So how that looks for a lot of people is, if this is a section of your back that's stiff, you have to be getting into a position where you're just sort of hinging through that section more than you need to, and then maybe twisting off to one side using your computer or sitting with your arm on the window ledge. It doesn't matter what it is, and you'll know better than me what that is for you, but I can guarantee you that something's there, because otherwise you don't deserve to have it. So that's sort of what I wanted to cover in terms of glute weakness. You probably thought by clicking on the video that you might get something in terms of the top 3 exercises to strengthen your glutes. There's a million different videos, and we'll definitely put some out in the next few days, just so you've got some direction and you don't have to go looking for it. But it sounds funny that de-stiffening your back is probably the best and fastest way to reclaim your inherent glute strength. But you still want to speed up that process by adding in some glute strength exercises into the mix. So like a lot of things, you want to do both. You don't have to just do one or the other, but you have to do something in terms of your back, otherwise those glutes won't function as they should. So as always, thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, please let us know in the comments below. We'll endeavour to answer all questions, and we want to make sure that these videos are specific to your needs. If you found it useful, please leave a like below and consider subscribing if you're new, because we want these videos to get to as many people as possible, because we just want to help as many people as possible. And gluteal strength isn't a sexy topic, but it's a really important one for a lot of problems that we see. And if you're not freeing up your back, then potentially you're missing the underlying cause of why you've got that in the first place. So do yourself a favor and check that out. Don't take my word for it. Base it on results, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at what you might find. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye.